Hello again. It's good to be with you as we look at Philippians again. And I want to look at Philippians chapter 3 today. And we should be able to finish the end of chapter 3. So let's look at verses 12 through. Actually, I'm going to carry it through chapter 4, verse 1. So from 3:12 through 4:1. Let's look at that. It's pretty repetitive in what Paul's saying here. And we still have this comparison being presented between Paul and his opponents, which I have labeled as the Judaizers, because they seem to fit the same. They seem to have the same characteristics as those presented in Galatians. In 2 Corinthians, Paul calls them super apostles. I don't know why he calls them that, except that maybe that's to emphasize they're being sent from someone. It seems to be that, and I don't know why for sure, but there's some kind of a tension going on with a form of Christianity that's coming out of Jerusalem right now that's affecting Paul's ministry. That's about all we really know. And we have a lot more of Paul's writings to look at. We don't have the other side of the coin, I guess, to some degree. So we can just go with what Paul has for us, but he's talking about his life versus their life, how you can compare the two. But anyway, we are at the end of the body of the letter. In fact, I think chapter 4, verse 1 is probably the end of the body. And after that, Paul will move into his, he gives an update about his situation a little bit, gives a little bit about travel plans, but he moves into his closing. And the letter closes up in chapter 4. So we are nearing the end of the letter, but more importantly, we're nearing the end of the body of the letter. And I bring this up because we should expect within the body of the letter to contain the instructive points, the main primary information that Paul is trying to convey to them. So if I was looking for exhortative material, probably the best place to look would be in the body of the letter. So we're coming to the end of this, and so this is be helpful as we start to think about maybe a summation of things that have been brought up so far. And Paul does sum this up to a large degree in a really nice manner. So, verse 12. In verse 12, Paul is really talking about his continual desire to understand Christ more. He's been bringing this up. He brought it up earlier in chapter 3. But he's still stressing this, his desire to want to grow. He wants to understand Christ more. He wants to understand the ministry of Christ more. He wants to understand more about the salvation act. I mean, pertaining to like resurrection and so forth. He desires to know more things. He's curious. He has a very curious mind. And so he's trying to develop or gain more understanding, maybe more, we could probably even say, reassurance. I mean, we're still talking about a human here, Paul. We have to understand that he's not of the same caliber as Jesus, and so I think a lot of times we overestimate Paul's his humanness, I guess, to some degree, and we forget that he is a human. So there may be, some things that he's still trying to grasp, and so that he can have a greater faith, I guess, to some degree. Now, I'm not saying that Paul was vacillating at all. I'm just saying he was human. Just like all of us, he needed to grow, and this would be a good example to follow. If he wanted to grow, and this is an apostle that's a very, very important apostle in the early church, did tremendous things, worked miracles. If he's wanting to grow and continue growing, then shouldn't we? Oh, I think we should, for sure. And so, now, he talks about the idea of having some kind of perfection in his life, that he's trying to understand this or attain this knowledge. Not that he's already been completed or something to that effect. And I was looking at different translations, how they do this. In fact, I think the New American Standard, no, it's the New English Translation, I'm sorry, has the best translation of this. And it says, I have not already been perfected. And that's really the idea. And so I bring that up because it seems that Paul is stressing some action in his life that he is not doing himself. So he's not the one that is completing himself. In fact, that would be a better way to understand this. He's wanting to have a complete knowledge about everything about Christ, about this new covenant ministry and so forth, what it all entails. He's wanting to know more and more about it. And so he says that he has not been completed in this. So he's drawing this information from the Lord, which is where we would expect him to be searching for this information. So Paul receives revelation from the Lord, and I'm sure that he's asking about this, and the Lord has not revealed more to him. Basically, there's not going to be more revealed to him. We're getting towards the end of Paul's ministry here, but it's still very inspiring to me and motivating to me. And I guess I have great respect for Paul because of his desire to grow, and how this should be our desire also. So he's still wanting God to do some things in his life. It fits real well within the idea that goes in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, or 12 verses 1 and 2, excuse me. How we have to have the Holy Spirit working in our lives, transforming us. And he does talk about transforming language later on in this chapter. And he uses a little bit different word, but it seems to be synonymous about how God is doing some things to change people. So Paul wants to learn more about it. And so Paul is stressing his continual relationship with the Lord. As I said, he is receiving his revelation from the Lord. And so he longs to learn more, longs to understand more, and that's his desire. It's quite remarkable, really. So now in verses 13 and 14, again, he goes on and that he wants to know more in order to be able to teach better. So he's wanting to be able to share this with other people and to move forward. I mean, that's what he's continually saying. And this marks the difference between himself and these other teachers. If you call them teachers, I use that word loosely. They're really, and I call them, and I think this is fitting, I think they are the thorn in the flesh. What Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 11, I'm pretty sure, talks about a thorn in the flesh. I think that the metaphor is talking about these difficult teachers that hound him at every corner when he goes somewhere and does something. It seems that these antagonistic influences follow him for some reason. They are very, there's great angst against what Paul is doing. And mostly it's because Paul is removing all of the Jewishness. He's not bringing the Jewishness, the Jewish customs into the New Covenant, is the way I should say it. In fact, I should intend that Paul's leaving things out. That's not the intent. The Lord left those things out in the New Covenant. Moving from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, things changed. Paul knew that. These others do not, because they don't have that special revelation from the Lord that Paul does. So again, Paul wants to continue to grow, whereas these people obviously do not want to. That marks a difference between himself and them. So in verse 15, he talks about having a maturity of thought, or mature people thinking a certain way. So it's mature Christians. Mature Christians have the same kind of desire. As you grow in the Lord, you become more curious and more. You long to be with the Lord. This is the kind of idea that Paul's projecting here, and he talks about mature people think this way. Now, also, we got to think about what has lied, was behind us, I should say. What's Paul been talking about in chapters 2 and 3? Well, he's given us great examples of people to mimic or to follow. Let's put it that way. And so he brings himself to the picture now, and how he also is a model that would be worth imitating. In fact, he brings that up in verse 17 for sure. So mature Christians are the same kind that want to grow. They want to learn more about the Lord. They long to be with the Lord. And through their interaction with the Lord, things change in the way that they think, the way that we think about our lives, the way we think about other people's lives, the way that we interact with other people. When you're around the Lord, you change the way that you behave. And in the converse, if you're around secular systems more, if you're in the world more, as the writer of 1 John would say, if you're in that kind of environment more, then you're going to be drawn to those kind of things, worldly values. And worldly values are opposed to Christian values. In fact, I find very few worldly values that would be applicable in Christianity. Very, very few worldly values. Our world pushes greed and pushes power, and it pushes oppression upon other people. It's a sign of the wickedness that's within humanity. The wickedness is from sin that came into this world. So Christians, though, when we start to let God into our lives and let God do more things, I should say, in our lives, things begin to change for the better. We just think about life better, and we become, we think, as Paul talks about in Colossians chapter 3, we think of things above. We think of things with heavenly things. Let's put it that way. The way we try to think as God thinks, so forth and so on. So now, in verses 16 and 17, he wants to make sure that they live appropriately. And so he's going to talk about imitating. Now again, he's given us all these examples. In fact, in verse 17 we have the word imitating there. He says something to the effect of be imitators of me is what he says. Be imitators of me. But he's been giving us many, many examples. So let's just talk about Paul's example then. He says, be an imitator of me. Well, one of the things that we could think of is that he definitely longs to be, to know more. He longs to have that deep, deep relationship with the Lord. Second thing is, and I'm about positive on this, is that, well, we know just from the Philippians text that he was moving up in Pharisaic Judaism. He says that. He says that he was blameless in the law. In Galatians, he talks about being further along than his peers. So we know that Paul was excelling. He studied under the great Rabbi Gamaliel. So he was going somewhere. He had notoriety, or there was great potential for notoriety. Let's say that for sure. And so he could have been prominent in the Jewish culture, in the religious philosophy of Judaism, which is Old Covenant. Now again, the Old Covenant's over. So Paul could have been prominent in that. But he gave it all up. I also think that he gave up wealth. I'm about positive he gave up wealth. For one thing, he was a Roman citizen is remarkable. The second thing is that he was able to move from Asia Minor, Tarsus, and come down to Jerusalem to study with Gamaliel is another mark that he probably had money to be able to make that travel and to basically relocate into a new place for this endeavor that he's wanting to pursue. But he gave all that up. In fact, he took a craft. I don't think he probably was a leather worker before he became a Christian. I think he probably was a leather worker. We translate as tent maker a lot of times. It could very well be that he made tents, but he definitely was a leather worker is what seems to be the better translation. But he could have learned that craft after he became a Christian. There's many years there we're not sure what Paul was doing after he became a Christian. He was after Damascus, when he was wanting to be arrested by people, he kind of just disappeared for a while until Barnabas found him. Now that doesn't mean that Paul wasn't active. He just wasn't active abroad. But anyway, Paul gave up an awful lot for the Lord. He wants them to be of the same mindset. In fact, he talks about he talks about thinking the same way. I'm trying to find out where it's at. Excuse me for a minute. He talks about him being a type also in verse 17. Others are types for them. So not only is Paul a type, but we have other types too. I forgot. Don't see where it's at right now, but I'm sure it's going to come up. Oh, I'm sorry. It's in verse 15. I went right past it. So in verse 15, what's interesting is it connects us back to chapter 2, verse 2. Same phrase is used here. Think this way. Something like that. Translate it that way. And so in chapter 2, verse 2, he says the same thing. He begins to talk about the examples. Now again, in verse 17, Paul talks about himself being an imitator, but we have many other imitators. And I want to repeat what's going on here. So I have in chapter 2, verse 2, the same phrase that shows up in chapter 3, verse 15. And in between, I have all these examples. So we have the example of Christ. Now, you cannot do what Christ has done, but you can humble yourself under the Lord's guidance as Christ did. Or under God's, I should say, because Christ is actually given the name of Lord. So you can, as Christ did, humble yourself and be obedient and do as Christ did as far as that is. I mean, he humbled himself and he was obedient. We can humble ourselves. We'll not be perfectly obedient, but we can try our very best. For sure. You have the example of Timothy in chapter 2, who was sincere, is what it says. That you know this person. You know him. He has the same character in the room by himself as he does in the room with 100 people. He's genuine. This is who you are. He is. You see him? That's what you get. That's Timothy there. He was a sincere Christian. And then you have Epaphroditus, who was so willing to serve the Lord that it almost cost him his life. Then you have the example of Paul, who gave up everything, notoriety, power, wealth, to serve the Lord. These are our examples, and they are great examples, and we should follow those kind of examples. In fact, people that perform like this, that live like this, they should be, you should respect them, for sure. That's for sure. I think of someone, not a biblical character, but you might have heard of him, called Francis of Assisi. Now, yes, he was part of Roman Catholicism, but the man's life, and this is a long, long time ago, back in medieval period, so there wasn't even a Protestantism at that time. So there was nothing like that. He was a Christian. But anyway, Francis, when he became a Christian, he came from a very wealthy family. The story goes that he gave up all his wealth, even all of his clothing, in order to take a complete vow of poverty to serve the Lord. And he ended up doing some amazing things for the Lord. These are the kind of people, the people that sacrifice, that give it their most for the Lord. Those people are to be revered. They're exemplary. And that's what Paul's talking about here. These are examples that we can look up to, for sure. So there are great, great things to look to. And he's basically saying, look to those kind of people on how you should live, and not to these other folks, the false teachers, the Judaizers. In verse 18, he's very strong. He calls them enemies of the cross. You see that? He says they are, it's in verse 18. Yeah, they are enemies of the cross. Wow. That is a strong statement. Now, he's been very harsh. Earlier, called them dogs. I don't think it's probably appropriate to call them that kind of name. There seems to be a vileness to it, I guess, to some degree. It just doesn't seem the best thing to do. However, understanding that they are enemies of the cross, I think, is very, very appropriate. In fact, a similar idea shows up in Ephesians, that they were enemies of God before they accept Christ as Lord and Savior. But anyway, these people are enemies of the cross. Well, why would they be enemies of the cross if they are promoting a form of Christianity? That's what they would say, that they're promoting some kind of a form of Christianity. Well, you look at verse 18, going into verse 19, talks about their condemnation. He talks about their desires are their God, that kind of idea. And so they have no shame. But when you become an enemy of the cross, there's a couple of things that happen here, in my view. Now, I wish he would flesh it out a little bit more for me, but I think I got a pretty good idea of what Paul is talking about here. First is this. They're denying that Christ's sacrifice is meaningful. They deny it. They must just be thinking of Christ as being a great prophet, something to that effect. They really didn't have the same, they did not have it at all, the same understanding of Christ and what that meant as a person, as a ministry, as an outcome, as Paul did. Now again, Paul has been revealed, this has been revealed to Paul by the Lord. Not so for the others. There's our difference. How can we tell the difference between the two? How would we know which one's true? The one who sacrificed the most, Paul, has sacrificed the most. Timothy sacrificed. Epaphroditus sacrificed. Christ sacrificed. He left heaven. These are the models we have to look to. Sacrificial type of people, not the other people that are self-promoting. This is the idea. In fact, it's the idea of Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 23. How will you be able to discern these folks? Look at their fruit. Look at what they produce. Jesus talks about trees. He says a bad tree can't produce good fruit, can it? Well, no. He says a good tree can't produce bad fruit, can it? Well, no. Judge them by their fruit. Look at their fruit. Yeah, they're going to be disguised. He says they're in sheep clothing. They're wolves in sheep clothing. They're disguised. But you'll know them by their fruit. That's the idea. When someone is on fire for the Lord, they sacrifice for the Lord. That's what these good examples of Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Paul show us. So they are the ones to imitate and not the other people. So, one of the lessons in Philippians, in fact, our culture right now, and it's been this way always, obviously, because we have misinformation back in biblical times. I can think there's several New Testament writings where one of the backdrops is some kind of misinformation that's plaguing the church. It's there over and over and over. So I know it's going to be a problem. And in our culture today, it is still a problem. Misinformation swirls around all the time. A lesson from Philippians would be is that those people who've given more time, more sacrifice, more preparation, more learning should be listened to and should be exemplified, that kind of idea. So we have people out there that just, they've not given anything to the Lord, but they expect an awful lot. Well, we need to sacrifice for the Lord. And that's what Philippians teaches us to a great degree. So, if the enemies of the cross, it would even become a little bit more, I think, theologically significant. You think about the cross event. So I've taught, and I will continue to teach as you stay with studies that I have, is that at the cross event, it was very important for Jesus to be 100% human and also 100% God. So, for some reason, if they're enemies of the cross, they're denying some aspect or both aspects of that. They could be overvaluing Christ's humanity and completely denying the divinity, which is probably a lot of what they are doing. So if they're doing that, then not only does that take away the forgiveness that's available on a broad and a scale of affinity, let's put it that way, an endless scale. There's forgiveness there for everyone because an infinite being, God, sacrificed himself. But they're also denying the humanity of it, and the humanity is important for the blessing to be transferred to followers of Christ, so that the blessing can be transferred, that kind of idea. So they're denying all this, and so they don't understand the meaning of the cross. Now, real quickly, as Christians, you will always need the salvation power of the cross in your life. Yes, you should try to be your very, very best. Does that mean you'll be perfect? No, never. You will never be a perfect individual. It's critical that you understand this. But you are to try your best. In fact, I think a paradox kind of happens for Christians. It's happened in my life. I don't know if it's happened in your life or not, but as I've grown closer to the Lord, I've started to understand how truly sinful I really am, because I didn't have understanding before. I wasn't gaining in knowledge or wisdom. As I started to gain in knowledge and wisdom by being with the Lord more, I was opened up more to sinful inclinations in my life. I started to understand that I was truly more despicable and in need of God's mercy in my life. Now, I try my very best. I regret it when I fail. I try to learn. But I've also learned that even if I overcome some things, some sinful inclinations in my life, there's a new one that's going to pop up. Why? Because we're in the world, and the world has a powerful influence in our lives. We need to put more of God in our life and less of the world, but you'll never be able to take the world completely out of your life until what happens in verse 20 happens. You see, in verse 20 is interesting. He tells us very plainly here, very, very directly, we are not citizens of this world. As Christians, this is not our home. That's the message of 1 Peter 2. This is not a unique message in the New Testament. It's there, over and over. This is not our home. I think there are way too many people that long to be in this world much more than they want to be with the Lord. This is not our home. The word citizenship is very clear here. Remember, this connects us back to chapter 1, verse 27. It's a word for conduct. The way you conduct yourself according to a community that you are a part of. Well, as a Christian community, we know that we are only aliens and sojourners here. Someday we will go to be with the Lord. Our citizenship is in heaven, is what he says. So we should be thinking of things above, and we await for this finality, this final moment to happen. And this is where he talks about transformation. Verse 21, transforming our body to be like his glorious body. So this is the idea where I get transformed in some kind of a glorification process, or a glorifying body. There's a different word that's used in 1 Corinthians 15, something like spiritual or something like that, or maybe it's a strange word that's used there. But anyway, here is the idea of being glorified. But something's going to happen at the very end. Things are going to be changed, and Paul doesn't really talk about much more of the finality here, except that people will be changed, but people who obviously are not Christian are not going to be. But at some point, this humanness that we have, human frailty, human problem that plagues us all the time, it will be eradicated. Our plight will be over. Let's put it that way. It will be over, and we long for that day, as Paul talks about here in chapter 4. I think this is probably the ending. In fact, I'm positive it is. Paul has strong feelings. He wants to go see them. He has great feelings for them. I mean, he'd be overjoyed to go see them, and he will, as far as we can tell. It's possible that he did. Maybe he didn't, but it's possible. We just don't know. But he longs to go back there, and he encourages them again to stand firm in the Lord. All right, let's stop right there. Next week we'll start in on chapter 4, verse 2, and just a couple more weeks on Philippians, and then we'll be done with it after that. So we can talk about what we're going to do after that. But anyway, have a great week, and I hope you found this area of Philippians helpful. Take care. I'll see you on Sunday.